We're still watching Business Morning, and yes, we are still on that February decision from the MPC. Now we have the Group Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Asset Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, joining us to share his thoughts on this. Mr. Chukwu, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Ini, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we just had an elaborate conversation with Acting Director from the CBN, warning us that we shouldn't get excited about the hold stands because it could also come out as being hawkish. But what's your perception about this hold stand of the MPC?
Interestingly, I had actually predicted that the position of the central bank should be hold. Principally because if you look at the macroeconomic environment, both that looking at the local environment and the global environment, there are too many uncertainties that a rational policy decision would be to wait and see development in the direction they will go. Because you don't want to take decisions today that you have to reverse in the next few months, or you regret that you took that decision. Take, for instance, looking at the local economy. Of course, we saw inflation at 24.48% in February. And like the CBN governor said, we shouldn't make the mistake of comparing this to 2024 inflation figure, because the inflation figure for January 2025 was based on an elevated base and was based on average prices for last year. So you're no longer doing what was the average price in January compared to January 2024 compared to average price in January 2025. You're now looking at what was the average price in the entire year. And if you cast your mind back, the inflation rate got as high as 34.9% before we got down to 34.8%. So it then means that the average inflation that we had last year will be in the region of 30%. So when we are talking of an increase, which what I'm just trying to emphasize that the increase, the inflation pressure is still quite steep because at 24% or average 25% inflation figure on a high base is still very high. So there is still a need for the central bank to take a policy decision that will ensure that the inflation rate does not worsen. Two, you look at exchange rate. We've seen some respite at the exchange rate level. But then what should also go with the exchange rate? Are we seeing a higher level of productivity? We saw a GDP growth rate in third quarter of last year about 3.46%. But that GDP growth rate was very fragile because the major contributors to the economy were growing at a very weak rate. Agriculture, which accounted for 28% of the GDP, grew at only 1.14%. Then the next one is telecommunications sector, which of course accounts for about 16% of the GDP, but grew about 5%. And then followed by trade, which accounts for 15% of the GDP, grew by 0.6%. Then followed by manufacturing, about 8.4% of the GDP, grew by only 0.1%. So if you look at the growth rate in these sectors, it's still very weak. So if you take out the telecommunications and the other sector that are big, account for up to 10% of the GDP, we are growing at very anemic rate. So you can't say your economy is actually rebounding as to actually now say I can actually go ahead and tighten, because this is what we say, look, I'm only fighting inflation, the economy is growing, so let me tighten to bring down inflation. Then you also look at the global economy. You look at the uncertainties around the price of crude oil, because of the policy of Donald Trump. You have uncertainty about the global trade and demand even for input materials, about the nationalistic protectionist policy of Donald Trump. So these are factors that will eventually have to settle and define their impact on the global economy. And that's when the central bank will be the most appropriate position to take a definitive decision on either tighten further or loosen. And so if you are in a position where you are uncertain whether to tighten further or loosen, the most appropriate thing becomes to hold, and which is what the Central Bank Monetary Policy Committee did.
It sounds like you see a hold. I mean, I know there was a period when it was almost predictable that every time the MPC met, it would be a hold position. Do you see us getting back to that era?
No, I don't think so. We are dealing with a current Central Bank governor that is very active. We're dealing with a monetary policy committee that very definitive and decisive in their position. Even at periods when people like I and a number of people say, look, further tightening was weakening the real sector of the economy, and that the inflationary pressure we are facing was not driven by excess liquidity or excess credit, that we should not continue to tighten. The central bank governor was still determined to tighten. So I do not think we can now begin to speculate that the central bank will the outlook will always be hold going forward. I think if they see further inflationary pressure, because the inflationary pressures, the downside risk about on inflation in the country is still there. The federal government has come up with a very expansionary fiscal plan of 54.9 trillion naira and planning to raise only about 14 trillion naira with a projected deficit about 13 trillion. But we know that even that projected deficit is actually understated or very optimistic, because we know that the revenue projections are not realistic. So that means there will be a lot of liquidity injection coming from the fiscal authorities. Even the budget is fully signed into law and they begin disbursing funds, we could see inflationary pressure come back. And remember that the next MPC meeting is May. So there could be a lot of liquidity surplus that will compel the Monetary Policy Committee to now tighten, to suck out that liquidity from the economy. So I can't at this point begin to say that we should begin to expect that going forward they behold. There could also be compelling reasons if inflation rate comes down materially, probably because of the drop in crude price and drop in pump price of fuel and some other, and then strengthening of the local currency. These two factors have the upside potential of bringing down inflationary pressures. If the local currency strengthens because of increased crude production, because of lower crude prices, and then you also have a lower inflation rate, or maybe there's improved food production. So the monetary authority can actually take a decision. Let's now focus on economic growth, and therefore they will decide to loosen, to allow liquidity flow into the economy at lower cost and allow for more productive activities.
So, I mean, I personally was happy when the central bank governor, and reiterated by the acting director, was on the show about the collaboration between the fiscal and the monetary authorities, because everybody now knows that the central bank does have its limits, you know, as to the policies they can engage in to tame inflation. But are you happy with the level of collaboration between the fiscal and the monetary authorities in this drive to tame inflation in the economy?
No, for me, it's not a matter of whether I'm happy. It's a matter of doing the right thing. Of course, we are coming from an era where there was a very significant fiscal doldrum, where the fiscal authorities under the President Muhammadu Buhari's era was almost non-existent or was not active in discharging their duties, which compelled the monetary authority to go into an overdrive to begin to do the works of the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities. So we had a kind of a convoluted monetary policy environment where a lot of the monetary policy actions were more of what should have ordinarily been described as fiscal decisions. But now we have some reasonable level of active fiscal and monetary regime. So in that, given the level of activeness of both arms of economic management, one would say that it's a material improvement in the engagement, in the discussions, in the understanding of what should be priorities to the government. But the conflicts are still there. I don't think the conflicts have been completely eradicated. I have just made allusion to the fact that the fiscal authority has enunciated or pronounced a very expansionary fiscal plan, and that fiscal plan will create liquidity suffix into the economy, which will put pressure on prices. And the monetary authority have always said repeatedly that their primary objective is price stability, and they will focus on price stability. So at the time when the monetary authority is focusing on price stability and the fiscal authority is focused on economic growth, you can still say that there has to be further harmonization of the primary and overriding objective. And my approach has always been most overriding objective is create a productive economy, and then that will bring down inflation in the medium to long term. But what I'm saying in the fact that a 54.9 trillion naira budget that is laden with deficit higher than even the projected 13 trillion deficit will counterbalance some of the measures that the monetary authority is taking to stabilize price levels. So that means we still don't have a perfect harmony in terms of policy harmonization.
But I do hope that at least we are heading that way. What about the area of FX management? We've seen a lot of policies and efforts from the central bank, the issue of remittances and all. Do you think we're on a comfortable track to a stable naira, or do you think more needs to be done?
Well, in the short term, one would say that the policies as at today will drive some level of stability in the exchange rate and possible improvement in the exchange rate. But there are also other factors that may unravel that directional movement or may vitiate the further strengthening of the naira. One is actually global environment. I had mentioned the fact that crude prices are likely going to decline because of Trump's decisions and policies. So if we do not produce more crude, of course, the report I saw said we are producing about 1.7 million barrels of crude and condensate. If we don't continue to ratchet up crude production and crude prices drop, it could put a lot of pressure on our foreign earnings, a lot of pressure on reserve that could reverse the gains we've made in exchange rate appreciation. Then what could central bank do? The central bank could reverse the current declining yield on treasury bills, which I think the director of financial service or monetary policy that you just finished interviewing had made allusion to. So if this, we saw a treasury bills auction on Wednesday, the 19th of February, with a stop rate for the 364-day bill at 18.43%. That's a material decline from the region of 22.8% we saw in November last year. Even this year, we've seen over 20% auction stop rate. And we also saw a decline in all the tenor buckets. The 91-day bill had a stop rate of 17%, and then the 182-day bill had a stop rate of 18%. These are instruments that 182-day instrument had been maintained a stop rate of about 18.5% for quite some time. So over 50 basis point cut off from that stop rate. So we've seen the central bank now borrowing at a reduced interest rate. But if what I had mentioned earlier, reserve begin to come under pressure because of lower crude production or lower crude prices, then the central bank, for it to sustain naira appreciation, naira stability, will have to offer these bills at much higher rate to sustain the interest of foreign portfolio investors. So it depends on how swiftly the central bank read macroeconomic outlook and take decisive actions or directional actions that will guide the response of economic agents in either patronizing our instruments or selling down our instruments, in either bringing capital inflow into the economy or having capital outflow from the economy.
All right, well, it does seem that you cannot win everything. So if you have your inflation tapering and your interest rates reducing, then the stop rates will also reduce, and that could also affect your FPI. I guess that's the reality of life, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Thank you so much for your time and your views this morning. Chief CEO of Cowrie Asset Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu.
Thank you for having me.